Fortunately, my father and I have about the same sort of shaped head. But once you put it on, it stays. I mean, it just remains itself.
Queen Elizabeth looked at Camilla, then she looked at those priceless jewels and said no. This was not the usual quiet and diplomatic no that the Queen uses when she wants to refuse someone without appearing to refuse them. She bluntly said no without any apology or remorse. Sources suggest that in her final years, Elizabeth made deliberate, specific, allegedly documented decisions about which pieces of her most historic and symbolically loaded jewelry collection would go to Camilla and which would not. The pieces allegedly withheld from Camilla were not minor. They were the ones that mattered most. The ones carrying Diana's memory, Elizabeth's legacy, and the British monarchy's visual identity. Sources suggest that every single one of them was allegedly designated for only one person, and that was no other person but Catherine, the woman who controlled the vault. There is a room beneath Windsor Castle that almost nobody outside the royal family ever sees. Not the public vaults where the crown jewels are displayed for tourists behind thick glass and elaborate security systems. Not the ceremonial spaces that appear in official photographs and documentary footage. It was a private, personal space where the most significant privately owned pieces of the royal jewelry collection have been stored, cataloged, and managed across generations of royal women who understood that what they wore was never simply about what they wore. Queen Elizabeth spent 70 years understanding that room better than anyone. She understood that every significant piece inside it carried a weight that went far beyond carats and settings and historical provenance. Every tiara, every necklace, every brooch she pinned to her coat at a Commonwealth ceremony or wore to a state banquet was communicating something to the watching world that no speech, no official statement, no carefully managed press release could replicate. Royal jewelry is power made visible, and Elizabeth knew this instinctively. She had known it since she was a young princess watching her own mother navigate the symbolic language of the collection with the deliberateness of someone who understood that appearances in the royal family are never accidental. By the time Elizabeth became queen in 1952 at the age of 25, she had already developed a relationship with the collection that would only deepen across the following 7 decades. She wore pieces strategically, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara at her own coronation portrait, the same tiara on British banknotes for years, the lover's knot tiara at state occasions, the Queen Mary tiara at significant ceremonial moments, each choice deliberate, each combination of occasion and object calculated to communicate something specific about continuity, legitimacy, and institutional identity. She was the collection's ultimate curator, its guardian, its most sophisticated interpreter. And sources suggest she was also, in her final years, its most deliberate protector. Here's the question worth sitting with from the very beginning of this story. Why would a woman who had managed the royal jewelry collection with extraordinary care for 70 years feel the need to allegedly make specific private decisions about certain pieces in her final years? What changed? What prompted a woman who had never needed to explicitly document her wishes about specific jewelry to allegedly begin doing exactly that? Sources suggest the answer has one name: Camilla. Camilla Parker Bowles became the Duchess of Cornwall when she married Charles in April 2005. It was a marriage that had required years of careful public relations management to make acceptable to a British public that had not forgotten what Charles and Camilla's affair had cost Diana. Elizabeth attended the blessing ceremony at Windsor Castle that year. She smiled and was gracious. She did everything the institution required of her in terms of publicly accepting her son's second wife. But acceptance and enthusiasm are different things. And sources suggest Elizabeth's private feelings about Camilla's place within the collection she had spent her life curating were considerably more complicated than her public graciousness suggested. Because Camilla's arrival into the royal family created an immediate and unavoidable question about jewelry, specifically about which pieces a new royal wife should wear, which pieces were appropriate for her position, and which pieces Elizabeth allegedly considered already spoken for in ways that Camilla's arrival did not change. Sources suggest that questions surfaced relatively quickly after the 2005 wedding. Camilla's team began exploring which significant pieces might be appropriate for various upcoming state occasions. and that certain of those explorations encountered resistance that sources describe as tracing directly back to Elizabeth's private wishes. Not administrative delays, not vault logistics. Resistance. The kind that comes when an institution's most senior figure has allegedly made a private decision and communicated it clearly enough that the people responsible for implementing it know exactly where the lines are. Sources suggest Elizabeth maintained private documentation of her wishes regarding her personally owned pieces. The pieces that passed as private property through her estate, rather than being held in trust for the nation. Her personal collection accumulated across decades of gifts, inheritances, and commissions. That documentation, sources suggest, became increasingly specific as Elizabeth aged, increasingly focused on ensuring that certain pieces reached certain hands, and increasingly clear, sources suggest, about which hands those pieces were not intended for. Camilla encountered those alleged designations more than once across the 17 years between her marriage to Charles and Elizabeth's death in 2022. She encountered them as a wall she could not get past. A wall built not from malice, but from intention. The specific intention of a woman who had spent 70 years deciding what the monarchy's future should look like, and who had allegedly decided, with the quiet, absolute authority she brought to everything, exactly who should wear its most important symbols when that future arrived, what those specific pieces were, which ones Camilla allegedly wanted most, and what Elizabeth's alleged refusals reveal about how she privately viewed the question of the monarchy's future. That is where this story goes next. The pieces Camilla allegedly wanted and was refused. A state banquet was held in London in 2019. Camilla arrived wearing the Boucheron tiara, a beautiful piece, elegant, well-crafted, but not connected to any particular royal history that the watching public would instantly recognize. Across the room, Catherine wore the lover's knot tiara. The room, the cameras noticed, and the royal watchers who track every jewelry decision with forensic attention noticed most of all. Because there is a difference between a royal woman wearing a beautiful tiara and a royal woman wearing that specific tiara. And everybody present understood the difference completely. The lover's knot. Tiara is not simply jewelry. It is a direct line connecting three women across nearly a century of British royal history. Queen Mary commissioned it in 1914 based on a design belonging to her grandmother, Princess Augusta Carolina of Hesse. It passed to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It passed to Queen Elizabeth II, and then it passed to Diana. Diana wore it more than any other piece in the collection during her marriage. Photographs of Diana in the lover's knot are among the most recognizable royal images of the 20th century. The tiara became so associated with her that when she returned it to the royal collection following her divorce from Charles in 1996, its absence from public view felt like a statement in itself. William gave it to Catherine as part of his wedding gift from the royal collection in 2011. The symbolism of that specific decision is not subtle. William took the tiara most associated with his mother and placed it on the head of his wife, a direct, deliberate, deeply personal bridge between Diana and Catherine, constructed through one of the most recognizable objects in royal history. Catherine has worn it more than any other royal since Diana. Each time she does, the public recognition is immediate and emotional. Now, here is the question sources suggest Camilla's team asked relatively early in the piece. Was the lover's knot available for the queen consort to wear on significant occasions? Sources suggest the answer they received was unambiguous. But the lover's knot tiara is only the beginning of this story, because sources suggest it was not the only significant piece that Camilla allegedly encountered as unavailable. Consider the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, Queen Elizabeth's personal favorite, the tiara she wore for her official coronation portrait, the one that appeared on British currency for decades. The piece is so associated with Elizabeth personally that its visual power is almost impossible to overstate. Camilla wore it at Charles's coronation in May 2023. That decision generated significant royal commentary. For Camilla's supporters, it was a statement of arrival, a signal that she had finally reached the position she had spent decades working toward. But sources suggest the coronation appearance was a specific sanctioned occasion, rather than an indication of ongoing unrestricted access. Sources suggest that Camilla's access to the Girls of Great Britain tiara for routine state occasions has been considerably more limited than her coronation appearance implied, and sources suggest the reason for that limitation traces back to Elizabeth's alleged private designations. Then there is the Queen Mary tiara, worn by Elizabeth on her own wedding day in 1947, one of the most historically significant pieces in the personal collection. Its connection to both Queen Mary and Elizabeth gives it a symbolic weight that makes it among the most powerful statements the collection contains about direct royal lineage and legitimate succession. Sources suggest this piece was also among those Camilla's team allegedly encountered as restricted, not available for general state occasion wear, not accessible through the standard channels through which significant royal jewelry is allocated for specific events, restricted in the way sources describe everything Elizabeth allegedly designated as restricted quietly and completely without the need for explanation, because the authority behind the restriction required none. Now here's what makes this more than a list of beautiful objects. Each of the pieces sources describe as allegedly restricted shares a specific characteristic. They are all directly and publicly associated with the women who held the position of legitimate queen in the public's understanding of royal history. Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and Diana, who was never queen, but who the British public crowned in their hearts in a way that no formal ceremony could have produced. Camilla is associated with none of those women in the public consciousness. She's associated with the gap between them, with the period when the institution failed Diana most completely. Sources suggest Elizabeth understood that association perfectly, and sources suggest her alleged decisions about the collection reflected that understanding with the precision of a woman who had spent 70 years reading the public's relationship with the monarchy more accurately than almost anyone around her. The Vault Keeper dimension adds another layer entirely. Sources describe specific occasions where Camilla's styling team sought access to particular pieces for significant upcoming events. State visits, major ceremonies, occasions where the jewelry choice would receive significant public attention and carry real symbolic weight. Sources suggest those requests encountered something more than standard administrative process. They allegedly encountered the institutional memory of Elizabeth's alleged designations operating exactly as intended. The people responsible for managing the collection's allocation allegedly aware of which pieces carried specific restrictions and why. The machinery of Elizabeth's alleged wishes functioning without her physical presence to enforce it, because that is how Elizabeth built everything she considered important, not on her personal authority alone, on institutional structures that would outlast her. But sources suggest the piece Camilla allegedly wanted most, the single object whose alleged restriction sources describe as hitting hardest and carrying the most personal sting, is not the Lover's Knot, or the Girls of Great Britain tiara, or the Queen Mary piece, but something else. Something whose history connects the most painful chapter of royal memory to the most hopeful vision of the monarchy's future, and something that sources suggest Elizabeth allegedly designated for Catherine with a specificity that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Now consider what Camilla allegedly understood each time she encountered one of those restrictions. Not simply that a specific piece was unavailable, that the woman who had controlled this institution for 70 years had looked at the question of who the monarchy's future belonged to and reached a conclusion. A conclusion communicated not through any official statement, through a list of pieces that were allegedly available to Catherine and allegedly not available to her. That list, sources suggest, tells you everything Elizabeth privately believed about whose head those jewels were made for, and whose was never part of the consideration at all. What Camilla allegedly did when she understood the full scope of those restrictions, and why sources describe her reaction as one of the most significant private moments in her entire royal life. That is what comes next. Camilla's alleged fury, the queen who cannot access the vault. There is a specific kind of humiliation that has no public outlet, the kind that happens in private rooms during quiet conversations between aides. In the gap between what your title says you are and what the institution you inhabit actually allows you to be. Camilla knows that humiliation intimately, She has known versions of it for 30 years. The public hostility after the Camilla Gate tapes in 1993. The years of being described in British newspapers in terms that would be unprintable today. The long, patient rehabilitation campaign that required her to absorb public contempt without visible reaction, while slowly, methodically rebuilding her image piece by piece. She survived all of it with discipline, with patience, with the particular resilience of someone who had decided that the end destination was worth whatever the journey required. And then she got there, a queen consort of the United Kingdom. Seated beside Charles at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, 2023, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara on her head, the full ceremonial weight of the British monarchy acknowledging her position in front of the entire watching world. She had arrived, except sources suggest she keeps encountering specific evidence that certain parts of the institution she arrived in were allegedly arranged before her arrival to ensure she would never fully inhabit them. And that evidence arrives in the form of jewelry. Here's the core question that this section needs to answer. What does it actually feel like to be queen consort of the United Kingdom and allegedly be told that certain pieces of the royal collection are not available to you? Not the crown jewels held in trust for the nation. Those are beyond any individual's personal ownership, and everyone understands that. The personally owned pieces and the privately held collection accumulated across generations. The pieces that passed as private property through Elizabeth's estate. The ones whose allocation decisions are not subject to any external oversight or constitutional constraint. Those pieces were allegedly restricted and unavailable to the woman who holds the second highest position in the British royal family. Sources suggest Camilla's team has engaged with the Vault Keeper dimension directly on multiple occasions. The Keeper of the Jewels role within the royal household is not a ceremonial position. It involves real responsibilities around the management, security, and allocation of significant pieces across the collection. The people who hold that role understand better than almost anyone outside the immediate royal family which pieces carry specific designations and which are available for general royal use. Sources suggest Camilla's styling team has had conversations with people connected to that function that produced responses they were not expecting. Not outright refusals delivered with any drama or confrontation. Nothing that could be pointed to as a single decisive moment of institutional hostility. Just the quiet, consistent, maddeningly polite communication that certain pieces were subject to prior designations. That certain requests could not be accommodated. That the pieces in question had been allocated in accordance with the late Queen's alleged private wishes, and that those wishes were not subject to revision. Sources describe Camilla's private reaction to this situation as evolving across the years since Elizabeth's death. Initially, sources suggest it was frustration. The frustration of a woman who had finally reached a position that should give her access to the full symbolic weight of royal life, and was discovering that certain significant pieces of that weight were allegedly beyond her reach. Sources describe a growing understanding on Camilla as part of what those alleged restrictions actually represent. It was not administrative inconvenience, vault, logistics, or the normal friction of a large institution managing complex historical assets. It was a deliberate statement from a woman who is no longer alive to be confronted about it operating through institutional structures that were allegedly built specifically to outlast her and enforce her wishes without requiring her physical presence. Elizabeth allegedly said something through those jewelry designations, or that she never said publicly, and Camilla understood exactly what it was. The message is not subtle when you decode it. These pieces belong to the women who represent the monarchy's legitimate bloodline future. They belong to the women whose connection to this institution is through birth and marriage to the direct line of succession. They belong to the women this institution was built around and will continue to be built around when the current generation passes. They do not belong to you. Not because you are unworthy in any personal sense, but because you represent something specific in the public's understanding of royal history. And that something is incompatible with the symbolic weight these particular pieces carry. Sources suggest that messages land differently, depending on the day. On good days, sources suggest Camilla processes it with the same discipline she has applied to every other obstacle across 30 years of navigating an institution that was never built with her in mind. On harder days, Sources suggest the cumulative weight of what those alleged restrictions represent is considerably more difficult to absorb. Because here is what makes Camilla's alleged situation particularly painful. She cannot argue against it publicly. She cannot release a statement expressing frustration with the late Queen's alleged jewelry designations without creating a scandal that would damage her position far more than the restrictions themselves. She cannot ask Charles to intervene without forcing him into a public choice between honoring his mother's alleged wishes and defending his wife's access to a vault. She is allegedly trapped by the particular authority of someone who is no longer present to be challenged. Elizabeth based her supposed authority and titles on the one thing no person can deny or escape, which is death. You cannot negotiate with a dead queen. You cannot lobby her for reconsideration. You cannot charm her or outlast her or wear her down with patience. You can only encounter her wishes operating silently and persistently through the institutional memory of people who knew exactly what she allegedly intended and have no incentive to pretend otherwise. Sources suggest Camilla has encountered those wishes repeatedly, and the encounter never gets easier, because every time it happens, it delivers the same message. Elizabeth saw the future of this monarchy clearly. She spent 70 years deciding what it should look like. And the jewelry she allegedly designated for Catherine versus the pieces she allegedly left available for Camilla is as explicit a statement of that vision as anything she ever said publicly. Camilla wears beautiful jewelry. Nobody disputes that. But sources suggest she wears it with the particular awareness of a woman who knows which pieces she is not wearing and why. What Catherine allegedly inherited and what it reveals about the depth of Elizabeth's private conviction about the monarchy's future. That is where the story goes next. Catherine's radiant inheritance, Elizabeth's vision made visible. There is a photograph that royal watchers return to repeatedly. It is the photograph of Catherine at the gala dinner at the Palace of Versailles in November 2023. The lover's knot tiara sitting on her head with the particular settled authority of something that belongs exactly where it has been placed. It was not borrowed or temporarily allocated for a specific occasion. It belongs to her. The public reaction to that photograph was immediate and emotional in a way that went far beyond admiration for a beautiful woman wearing a beautiful object. People recognized something that was more than just the tiara. It was what the tiara represented. The unbroken line it drew from Queen Mary to Elizabeth to Diana to Catherine. 4 women across more than a century of British royal history, connected through a single object that somehow managed to carry all of their stories simultaneously. That is not an accident. That is not simply good jewelry. That is Elizabeth's alleged vision made physically visible in a single image. And sources suggest Elizabeth intended exactly that. To understand Catherine's alleged inheritance fully, you first need to understand the relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine that developed across the 13 years between Catherine's marriage to William in 2011 and Elizabeth's death in 2022. It was not the relationship the public typically imagines between a 96-year-old monarch and her 30-something granddaughter-in-law. Not a formal, distant, or carefully managed institutional relationship between a queen and a future queen characterized by protocol and appropriate deference. It was something more personal than that. Genuine and more rooted in mutual recognition than in institutional obligation. Sources describe Elizabeth as seeing in Catherine something she had been looking for across decades of watching royal marriages navigate impossible pressures. She saw steadiness, the particular kind that is not simply the absence of drama, but the active presence of something more solid. Catherine had been tested across 9 years of the most relentless public scrutiny any royal girlfriend had ever faced before her marriage. She was photographed constantly, written about cruelly, subjected to the particular British press sport of building someone up before systematically dismantling them. Yet, she could not be dismantled. She had arrived to her wedding day on April 2011 with the same composure she had carried throughout, unflappable in public, private about everything that mattered, disciplined in the way the institution demands and so rarely finds in the people who marry into it. Elizabeth noticed early in Catherine's relationship with William, before the engagement and the public confirmation, that this was the woman William had chosen. Elizabeth was already paying attention to how Catherine handled pressure, and what she allegedly observed satisfied her in ways she rarely expressed publicly, but communicated through actions that people paying close attention could not miss. The private meetings between Elizabeth and Catherine that became a documented feature of Catherine's early royal life. The one-on-one audiences at which no aides were present, and the content of which was never officially disclosed. The particular warmth Elizabeth allegedly extended to Catherine in private settings that sources describe as noticeably different from the formal graciousness she extended to Camilla. Sources suggest it was during one of those private meetings that Elizabeth allegedly communicated her wishes about specific pieces of the jewelry collection most directly. Not a formal legal arrangement, not a documented instruction delivered through lawyers or estate management professionals. A personal conversation between two women who had developed a genuine understanding across years of quiet, private interaction. The older woman telling the younger one something about what she believed the future should look like, and using specific objects to make that belief concrete and permanent. Sources suggest Catherine left that conversation with a clarity about her future role in the collection's stewardship that no public announcement had ever established. A clarity that sources describe as settling something for Catherine that had perhaps been uncertain before. Now consider what Catherine's alleged inheritance actually consists of. The Lover's Knot tiara is the most emotionally resonant piece for obvious reasons. Its Diana connection gives it a power that goes beyond anything its historical provenance alone could produce. When Catherine wears it, the public does not simply see a beautiful tiara. They see Diana. They see William's love for his mother expressed through his choice of wedding gift for his wife. They see a continuity that the public finds deeply comforting in a family that has given them so much to be uncomfortable about. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara carries a different kind of power, Elizabeth's power. The authority of a 70-year reign communicated through an object so thoroughly associated with the late Queen that its appearance on any other head will always carry the weight of that association. When Catherine eventually wears it as Queen Consort, the transfer it represents will be unmistakable to the entire watching world. But sources suggest the most significant piece allegedly designated for Catherine is neither of these. Sources describe a specific piece whose history connects directly to the most foundational moments of modern royal history, a piece that carries within it the stories of the women who built the monarchy's relationship with the British public across the 20th century. A piece whose alleged designation for Catherine rather than Camilla represents Elizabeth's clearest and most personal statement about who she believed the institution's future truly belonged to. Sources are deliberately careful about identifying this piece specifically. The designation is allegedly private. Its public revelation would force a palace response that nobody inside the institution currently wants to manage. But sources suggest its existence and its alleged designation is known to a small number of people inside the palace whose positions give them access to that knowledge, and sources suggest Catherine is among them. Think about what that knowledge means for Catherine as she carries out her current royal duties. Every state occasion, every significant ceremony, every public appearance where jewelry choices communicate institutional messages to the watching world. She is allegedly wearing some of the most significant pieces in the collection, knowing that certain others are coming. Designated specifically for her, protected allegedly by the late Queen's private wishes from the moment those wishes were formed. That knowledge gives Catherine a particular settled confidence in her position that observers occasionally note without fully understanding its source. She is not simply a future queen waiting for her husband's accession to give her the role she has been preparing for. She is allegedly the custodian of a vision. Elizabeth's vision, communicated through objects whose symbolism the British public understands instinctively and emotionally in ways that transcend any official statement. Sources suggest Elizabeth chose that method of communication deliberately because jewelry endures. It cannot be revised by a press release. It cannot be reframed by a palace spokesman. It cannot be managed or softened or given context that changes what it fundamentally represents. It simply exists in specific hands, communicating its message every time it is worn. And sources suggest Elizabeth, who spent 70 years understanding the symbolic language of the collection better than anyone, used that permanence intentionally to protect the future she believed in to designate the woman she believed should inhabit it, and to communicate both of those things in a language that would still be speaking clearly long after she was no longer present to say anything at all. Why Charles cannot simply overrule any of this, and what it means for the monarchy's future that he allegedly has no intention of trying. That is the final piece of this story, the final verdict, why Charles cannot fix this, and what it means forever. Charles knew about the jewelry situation before Elizabeth died, not because anyone sat him down and formally briefed him, or because Elizabeth called him into a private meeting and laid out her alleged designations with the specificity of a legal instrument, but because he knows his mother. He knew her across our 76 years of a relationship that was complicated, loving, occasionally painful, and always at its foundation, built on a mutual understanding of what the institution they both served required of them. He understood how Elizabeth communicated the things that mattered most to her, not through official statements or formally documented instructions that created legally binding obligations, but through patterns and repeated consistent signals delivered across time to the people who needed to receive them, through the institutional structures she built around her wishes to ensure those wishes would outlast her. Charles understood all of it. He understood specifically what Elizabeth's alleged jewelry designations represented. Not a personal attack on Camilla. And though Elizabeth was not a cruel woman, and Charles knows that too, she did not allegedly designate those pieces for Catherine out of malice toward the woman his son married into this family. She allegedly designated them out of conviction about the future, about whose hands those particular symbolic objects belonged in when the era she had built gave way to the era that would follow it. Charles understood that conviction. He may not have been comfortable with all of its implications, but he understood it. And here is the core question this final section has to answer. Why has he done nothing to change it? He is the king. The pieces in question passed through Elizabeth's estate. The institutional structures governing the collection's allocation operate within a framework that Charles sits at the top of. If he wanted to revise his mother's alleged designations in Camilla's favor, what is stopping him? The answer sources give operates on 3 distinct levels. Each one is more significant than the last. The first level is legal and institutional. The allocation of personally owned royal pieces involves mechanisms that are considerably more complex than a simple decision by the reigning monarch. Elizabeth's estate was managed through formal legal processes. The distribution of her personally owned jewelry involved trustees, legal advisors, and formal documentation that created records and expectations that cannot simply be overridden by a subsequent preference. Certain pieces that sources describe as allegedly designated for Catherine have already moved through those formal processes in ways that make revisiting them legally complicated. Not impossible, but complicated enough that attempting it would generate documentation, legal activity, and institutional disruption that would be very difficult to keep private. And in the royal family, very difficult to keep private generally means impossible to keep private. The second level is political and reputational. Consider what it would mean publicly if Charles were seen to be revising his late mother's alleged wishes about royal jewelry in order to benefit Camilla. The story that would generate is not a story the palace could survive comfortably, a king dismantling his mother's legacy for the woman millions of people still associate with his first wife's suffering, using pieces whose Diana connection makes them among the most emotionally loaded objects in the public's relationship with the royal family. The reputational cost of that story would dwarf anything that Camilla's restricted access to certain vault pieces currently costs her. Charles understands political calculus. He spent his entire adult life navigating institutional politics with a sophistication that his public image has never fully reflected. He knows exactly what that story would cost. And sources suggest he has concluded that no jewelry allocation is worth paying that price. The third level is the one sources describe as most significant and most personal: William. Sources suggest William's position on Elizabeth's alleged jewelry designations is entirely consistent with everything else he has allegedly been doing since inheriting the duchy. The Annabel Elliot removal, the access narrowing, the patronage redirections, the alleged archives situation, and the Balmoral question. All of it reflects the same fundamental principle. Elizabeth's era is ending. William's era is beginning. And the people and objects and symbolic resources of the monarchy are being repositioned accordingly. Elizabeth's alleged jewelry designations fit perfectly within that principle. They represent his grandmother's private verdict about the future, a verdict that aligns completely with the future William is allegedly building. A future centered on Catherine as queen consort, on the direct line of succession, and on a monarchy that communicates continuity through the women who carry its most significant symbolic objects. Sources suggest William has made his position clear to Charles on this question without any dramatic confrontation. In the quiet, direct way, William communicates things that matter to him most. Elizabeth's wishes stand. Catherine's inheritance is protected. Any revision of those alleged designations is not something William will accept. Charles, sources suggest, is not inclined to test that position, and so the alleged designations stand, operating silently, persistently, doing exactly what Elizabeth allegedly intended them to do. Now pull back to the full picture, because this story at its largest is not about jewelry at all. It is about legacy, and the particular kind of power that outlasts the person who built it. It is about a woman who spent 70 years understanding that the most important statements are made not in speeches or announcements, but in the quiet, deliberate, permanent decisions that shape what comes after you. Elizabeth allegedly looked at the question of the monarchy's future with the clarity of someone who had been preparing for that future their entire life. She saw in Catherine what she needed to see: steadiness, discipline, and the capacity to carry the symbolic weight of the institution without being crushed by it. And she saw in the pieces she allegedly designated for Catherine a way to communicate that vision permanently, in a language the public would understand instinctively, in a form that could not be revised by a press release or managed by a palace spokesman or softened by anyone's subsequent preference. The jewels Elizabeth refused to give Camilla were never really about keeping something from Camilla. They were about giving something to Catherine, a direct line from Elizabeth's hands to Catherine's, bypassing the woman who occupied the space between them, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction about where the monarchy's future truly lived. Sources suggest Camilla understands all of this now with a completeness she perhaps did not have in the early years after Elizabeth's death. She understands that the pieces she cannot access are not simply beautiful objects sitting in a vault. They are Elizabeth's final word on the question Camilla spent 30 years trying to answer in her own favor. The question of who the monarchy truly belongs to. Elizabeth allegedly answered it in the most permanent way available to her. Not in words, but objects. Specific objects in specific hands communicate their message every time they appear in public, and every time they do not. Catherine knows which pieces are coming to her. She has allegedly known for years, and Camilla knows which pieces are not. She has allegedly known that for years too. The difference between those two women's knowledge is the difference between inheriting a vision and being excluded from it. Elizabeth allegedly made that difference permanent, and sources suggest no one inside that palace, including the king himself, has any intention of changing it. Queen Elizabeth never gave a speech about who the monarchy's future belonged to. She never needed to. She said it in diamonds, in tiaras, in the quiet, permanent, allegedly deliberate decisions about which pieces went to Catherine and which ones Camilla was allegedly never going to touch. 70 years of understanding how power works. And one final, silent, unassailable statement. Catherine's inheritance is allegedly secure. Camilla's alleged exclusion is allegedly permanent. Was Elizabeth right, or did Camilla deserve better? Tell us in the comments.